Welcome to the Week in Politics with Michelle Grattan. I'm Caroline Fisher and I'm filling in for the Vice-Chancellor, Deep Saini. Hi Michelle, how are you?
Hi Caroline.
Look, the debate around housing affordability has been bubbling away in the lead up to the May budget. What kind of pressure do you think that the federal government is under to pare back any kind of concessions?
I think it's under a lot of pressure because it set out housing affordability as a centrepiece in this coming budget, and therefore expectations are raised quite high, and that's always dangerous for a government. Add to that this is a really complex issue. There's no one magic solution to getting more affordability, to enabling young people to buy their first home. It's a whole mix of questions. The Reserve Bank Governor outlined many of the issues this week, and they're of course on the side of monetary policy, budgetary policy. State governments have main responsibilities in areas of supply. So there's just not a single answer, and yet you've got these expectations, and the government has also locked itself out of doing some things like attacking negative gearing because of Labor's policy. It wants to accentuate the differences, but also it's a bit afraid of driving housing prices down. So it's caught between trying to assist people to get into the market, but not too much affect the value of owners who would be very put off if they found that the selling prices were suddenly collapsing.
On another related tax issue, the government did have a win last week in legislating some of its company tax measures, and they're suggesting that there's more to come. Treasurer Scott Morrison was unable or unwilling perhaps to say what the size of the economic benefit of these tax cuts. Should they have some kind of modelling on this?
They don't apparently have any modelling at the moment, and I think the benefit in terms of growth and jobs of these first company tax cuts, which go to small and medium-sized businesses over the next few years, is pretty limited, because what bang you get for these bucks is from the cuts to bigger companies, and even in the original package, those weren't going to come for a long time, and now the Senate won't countenance them anyway. Scott Morrison points out that we have modelling for the whole package, and that's only 1% of growth over quite a long time. It's a 10-year package, and it's really after you've got all those cuts. The growth dividend for the more limited cuts, he says, hasn't been modelled by Treasury.
Okay, well the Liberal Party is looking inside today. The review into the last year's federal election campaign, the report is going to be delivered today. And of course the Federal Liberal Party Director Tony Nutt has resigned ahead of the delivery of this report. Do you think that the Liberal Party headquarters deserve some kind of blame for last year's election result?
Look, I think yes, they've got to share some responsibility, but the main responsibility, I would have thought, lies with the politicians, the leader. Malcolm Turnbull ran a poor campaign, and it is true that the Liberal Party has not got a very good on the ground campaigning capacity, and that must be sheeted home to the federal executive. You don't build that up just at the last moment. You've got to develop that throughout a term, throughout more than one term indeed. Also, fundraising is clearly a problem for the Liberals these days. It used to be Labor that was crying poor, and Liberals got a lot of money from business. Now business is more reluctant to kick in, and I think that the campaign was under-resourced. But if the leader had been really firing, if people had seen a vision from Malcolm Turnbull, then some of those problems with the campaign wouldn't have been so important. There was a big argument too about whether the Liberals should have run a more negative campaign, whether they should have really targeted Bill Shorten in a very tough personal way over his union background and so on. Now, the research suggested that people would be turned off by that, and Malcolm Turnbull wanted to go positive. And I think that that is a sort of continuing argument in terms of looking back on what happened, what went wrong.
Okay, so you're talking about Malcolm Turnbull having run a bad campaign, and Peter Dutton has been out talking about the bad polling. So do you think that there's pressure perhaps around the release of this review, the consecutive bad polling for Malcolm Turnbull? How do you think that's going to play out?
If we're talking leadership pressure, I don't think that there is at the moment, other than pressure to perform better, because there are not alternatives, because there's no real appetite to go down the throwing out a leader path again. The transactional costs of throwing out a very unpopular leader even are now obvious. But if in a few months Newspoll hasn't turned around, and that was a measure that Malcolm Turnbull used against Tony Abbott, if the polls continue to be bad, by the end of this year we'll certainly see a lot more leadership talk. Whether we'll see action is quite another matter, but the talk itself, of course, is very damaging for a leader in the community.
So, I mean, rather than his leadership, the actual Liberal Party's leadership with Tony Nutt having resigned, what type of person do you think they'll be looking for to replace him?
It's interesting that there's no obvious candidate to be federal director. Normally you would go to one of the state directors. Of course, out in the community these names are not known, but that would be the normal course. But there are not experienced state directors. People have come in recently, and I think that field is fairly thin. If you go outside, again, it's such a difficult job, especially now, because you have to build up the party organisation. I mentioned fundraising before. That's a very difficult situation at the moment. And also, the person will be coming into a party which may lose the next election. There's every prospect they could lose the next election. So you could find yourself a very short-term director, or you could find yourself with the task of rebuilding a shattered party after an election defeat. So it's not a job that you'd think people would rush to, but politics being what it is, no doubt there'll be plenty of aspirants.
Bill Shorten, if we turn to the Labor Party, he seems to be making the most of the non-parliamentary sitting period, and he's back in his Bill bus touring around Queensland. Is that an effective way to campaign, this grassroots type of campaigning that he's embarking on?
I think it is. He's done more than 40 town hall style meetings since he started doing those meetings in 2015, and of course we saw the Bill bus in the campaign. What he does, I think, is drill down to a very, very local level. Now, we see politicians, we see the Prime Minister flying in, flying out, giving press conferences in various parts of the country. The permanent campaign means everyone's travelling all the time. But those community forums are effective in that they do give a feeling of engagement to a very disengaged electorate, and I would imagine they also activate the local campaigners, people who support the Labor Party, because the leader's coming to town, he's having a meeting, and more activities required, presumably attendance is encouraged. So I think that over time it is an effective campaigning style, and of course it's one that's more available to an opposition leader than a Prime Minister, because a Prime Minister firstly doesn't have as much time to do it, and secondly doesn't want to expose himself that much to those sorts of forums.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.